Pride in London welcomes you all to our panel event today, London Pride Past and Present, which is being held to celebrate LGBT History Month. I'd first like to start by thanking Amnesty International UK for kindly hosting our event in this wonderful venue. Thanks to Tesco for providing wine and food. We will have a drinks reception at the end, so I encourage you to stay. Thanks to Linda and Joel for filming this evening and taking their time. And a big thanks to our volunteers, wonderful volunteers who have spent so much time putting all of this together. It's a fabulous job. Our 2015 parade theme is Pride Heroes. You will have noticed an A5 piece of paper on your chair. Would you please take just a few minutes of your time, if you could fill it in and leave it on your chair? We'd be very grateful. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So, in terms of who I am, I'm Huma Kazi. I'm a board member of Pride in London, and I'm moderating this evening's discussion. Our panel members consist of the inspirational Lisa Power, who's been going to Pride for over the last 4 decades. And in the late 80s served as the Secretary General for ILGA, the International Lesbian and Gay Association. She's also a founding member of Stonewall. The trailblazing Phyll Opoku-Gyimah. Phyll is an activist, an executive director, and co-founder of UK Black Pride. I first met you when we spoke at a panel at a Gay Women's Network event. The impressive S.J. Jacobs, who is on the management committee of FDM London and supporting trans masculine, non-binary, and trans people within our community. We will be shortly joined by Peter Tatchell. Peter is a human rights and LGBT campaigner, both in the UK and abroad. Please feel free to tweet during or after this panel session. The hashtag is LGBTHN. Should you wish to use a Twitter handle, it's London LGBT Pride. So, as part of my role as timekeeping, let me give you a quick rundown how we have planned this evening. We've got about just under an hour for the panel discussion. Then there will be 15 minutes allocated for Q&A. There will be some roving mics. They'll not be on their own. They'll be attached to our lovely volunteers. So please raise your hand when you'd like to ask a question, and please speak into the microphone, one at a time. Then there will be a closing statement by my fellow board member, Stephen Ward, our lovely vice chair as well. And then you will be invited downstairs for the drinks reception. So, Lisa, first question is for you. When was your first Pride event in London, and what was it like for you?
I think my first Pride event in London was my first Pride event full stop. And I think it was 1976. When we marched to Hyde Park, and there were so few of us that we were able to have a little rally in the grass there. I remember there was a row. There always was. There always has been. I don't know a Pride where there hasn't been a controversy of something or the other. And that year, people were being rude to Tom Robinson. He got some boos because people felt he'd got a bit above himself by becoming a pop star, when he was just another volunteer on Gay Switchboard. And then there was a complaint, I don't know why, about some lesbians who got referred to as the posse of little lesbians, which was technically inaccurate as well as rude. But we had a wonderful time. We had an absolutely amazing time. And it was ramshackle and it was lovely. And it had the spirit that every Pride I've ever been to has, which is somewhere between defiance, jubilation, and determination.
Fabulous. Phyll, how about yourself?
Well, it
very clever soon.
Well, I'm not. So I went to my first Pride in 2000. I think that if I count, 96 was my first Pride, walking past a particular Pride, but I was child in tow then, and I was doing what was called conformity, you know, and I was living that double life. So I went past that Pride and I was like, oh my gosh, that is so real. But 2000 was my very first Pride that I could say, wow, I've arrived. And it was exciting, it was, as you say, Lisa, jubilant, it was very surreal because I didn't believe I could be in a place after having come out and lived a double life and had so much excitement.
Fantastic, fantastic. SJ, it was 2004, wasn't it?
I think it was, yeah, but you know, same. No, I ostensibly was taking a group from my university. There were a few of the women from my university society who wanted to go down to London, so we all got train tickets and we came down. And I think that they wanted to see Kylie. I think that might have been the reason. But we all went down anyway, and the experience I think is much the same as has been said already. It was just a space where I know that Freedom 2 was the theme from last year, and it was the freedom to be completely and entirely yourself, and to know that whatever it was that you were doing, however that you were expressing yourself in that moment, didn't matter to anyone and would be celebrated rather than frowned upon and looked at as an object of delight and, you know, maybe slightly countercultural and subversive as well, if you could manage that. And that was the day. And like Lisa said, it was one of those years when it was Pride in the Park, so we snaked our way down over to Hyde Park, which between us, I think is the best way to do Pride, really. Just Pride's in the park, any park, you know, Victoria Park, any bit of ground that you can find. That's a good way of doing it.
Okay, thank you. Peter, it wasn't for Kylie, was it?
Definitely not. My first gay pride was in 1972, which was the first ever gay pride in Britain. And I was one of about 30 or 40 people who helped organise it. I can remember we were very, very sceptical and concerned that no one would turn up. And we were rather gratified that between 700 and 1,000 people did march that year. And I can remember also very well the way in which we were treated by the police. There was virtually a police officer for every single marcher. We were hemmed in. Police officers openly said homophobic things like, watch out for the puffs and the benders, get her, she's a fucking dyke, you know, all that really outrageous stuff. But that's because in those days we were still criminals, and the police treated us in that way. You know, as if we were marching in favour of terrorism. That was the atmosphere at times. But there was a great carnival atmosphere despite that. The other thing I'd say is that there were two sort of main factions on the march. One was the sort of CHE Sappho wing, the other one was the Gay Liberation Front wing. And one part of the march was all about equality, and the other part was all about liberation. Because in the Gay Liberation Front, I think the word equality hardly ever passed our lips. We weren't interested in equality under an unjust society. We wanted to change society for the benefit of every LGBTI person. And I'm very glad to say that I've been on every single Pride since, and I'm determined to the day I die, I will notch every single one up every year.
Peter, you just mentioned the word carnival, the carnival atmosphere, and you were also referring to it as a march. And we were having this conversation, you told me something in your book and from the past. Could you please tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, if people want to know more, and this is not an advert because you can't actually buy it now except in the second-hand market, but there's a whole load in an oral history here which I did in '95 called No Bath But Plenty of Bubbles, and it's exactly as Peter talks about it, that's what happened. But what many people have forgotten is that actually that first Pride March was promoted, as well as being a Pride March, as a carnival. GLF was absolutely brilliant at doing politics and fun together. And actually I think that's a spirit that we need to return to in many ways, that politics can be fun and fun can be political. And I think the Pride Parade, Carnival, whatever you want to call it, should embody both those spirits together.
Fantastic. So, Phil, for your first in 2000, did you just participate? Were you organising? What was happening in sort of the backstage for yourself?
I was finding out about myself, and it was a moment, as I say, of absolute change, from being a woman who had a child and didn't really understand what all these changes were about myself. I wasn't organising, I was participating, and I very much sat on the outside watching everybody else. There was one thing that struck out about that particular Pride, and every other Pride since then that I've been to, is that it wasn't as completely reflective of who I am as a person. And when I say that, I talk about the intersections of being a black lesbian who identifies as being a feminist as well, and who has a child who's of working class background, child of a migrant parent, you know. So there was a lot about the Pride which absolutely drew me in, and I loved every moment of just being there. But there was also still something missing, and I think human nature tells us we want to find somewhere where we belong, and belonging is important. And I found a family there, but I didn't know whether the family quite understood me to a greater or lesser degree, so hence why UK Black Pride was born.
And yes, with so many different layers of diversity as well, and we have that diversity within our own community. Peter, you also spoke about being part of it from the very start. 700 to 1,000, you said, in the first march. 2014 for us marked 30,000 in the parade. And huge inroads have been made from a legislative, societal and cultural front. What is your opinion in terms of how this has evolved?
Well, I think for me, the heyday of Pride was 1997. It's much slated, but there were at least 100,000 people on the march and 300,000 people at the festival in Clapham Common. That was the moment when we reached our acme in terms of numbers and reach. And it was also incredibly political. And lots of groups, not just outrage, but lots of groups had very clear political demands for equality and inclusion, like getting rid of the ban on gay and lesbian people in the armed forces, equalising the age of consent, equal rights for trans people, same-sex parenting, civil partnerships, or some form of legal recognition for same-sex couples and so on. So it was a very political element. The other thing I'd say is, back in the early days, the word intersectionality has become a buzzword at the moment. But people were doing this in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the Gay Liberation Front was allied with the Black Liberation Movement, with working class struggles, with the struggles of people in Ireland for self-determination, with the Women's Liberation Movement. Around the same time, I remember we joined with the Women's Liberation Movement. Actually, it was late 71, so it was before the first Pride. Late 71, the Gay Liberation Front joined with the Women's Liberation Movement to protest at the Miss World contest. And GLF's contribution was the alternative Miss World. So we had misconceived, misrepresented, misappropriated, and so on, so on, so on. And then we also made the connections with other topical issues. The war in Ireland was still raging. Pakistan had just invaded newly independent Bangladesh. So we had, a woman, dressed up as Miss Bangladesh, but swathed in bloody bandages to represent the horrors of that civil war, or that war against Bangladesh's independence. And also, with regard to Ireland, we had a Miss Ulster, also swathed in blood and bandages to represent the war in Ireland. So we did actually make those different connections and see our struggle as part of a broader struggle for social liberation. We didn't have a narrow gayist focus. We saw liberation for everyone.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that point because I've got Phil here who's sort of humming and would like to make a point, and I would definitely encourage my panelists to feel free to make any comments while another speaker is speaking. So, Phil?
Good, Peter. Here we go. I have done my research in terms of what was there before, and I think when you think about and look back to women like Linda Bellos, Monica Beadle, Elaine Mackenzie, they have all, and Femi Otoju, they have all taught me so much about what was before, because you can't actually go into the future without knowing what your past was. So whilst that was there, people continually are coming out. So when that history or her story is lost within the movement, and we don't archive or document our history or her story well enough, some of the younger generation then don't know that movement. So when they do attend their first Pride, which may be of the now, the political statement that was made then is not necessarily reflective of what we see now. And I totally believe that London Pride has made some great gains in changing some of what I saw at my first Pride, and working with a cross-section group of people and working with UK Black Pride. But for many of the people in my community that I have spoken to, who are coming out, who are young, who have never really experienced the Pride as you explain it, that's why I say it wasn't quite reflective of me. And that was at that particular time. But I do appreciate, I respect, and I understand and know the movement as it stood then. But I think that we have a way to go in changing sometimes the dynamics of what Pride looks like. Yes, it needs its commercial element. Yes, it needs the fun activity. But you see, for me, when I get up, all of this never changes. So I am a political statement. So if I go somewhere and it doesn't actually feel or look like me, or I'm not relating, or there's not much I can relate to, it becomes a point of, do I choose being black over LGBT, or do I choose being a woman over being black? And that's what has left many of the people in my community in a bit of a soul-destroying position. So I wish that I was at the time 72. I don't want to show my age, but I was a little bit young there. But I wish I was able to have experienced that pride. I really do. But what we're trying to do now is create some of that so that the next generation can feel that, understand that, and know that coming out, celebrating our achievements at Pride is also a political statement.
And that's so important, what Pride means to us personally. And Lisa, for yourself, and SJ then for you, how has, in your view, Pride evolved over the years in comparison to other nations' prides, and also with your experience of having been the Secretary General of ILGA? What would you say?
I would say that it's very different in different places. There are huge prides in some places. I was lucky enough to be on the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York, actually marching with Stephen Fry, and he was with the Stonewall group, and it was his first ever Pride, and he, bless him, he'd gone and got an undershirt and dyed it pink because he thought that was important for the occasion. And that was huge and absolutely massive, and they gave us all big placards from our country, and I remember they gave us one that said United Kingdom. Luckily there was one bisexual woman with us, and she had a lipstick which we stole and ruined and crossed out King and wrote Queendom. So we marched as the United Queendom all together. But there are also tiny prides, and in some ways Peter knows more about this recently than I do. The prides that struggle to exist, the prides that are banned, the prides that it's actually incredibly dangerous to go on. So I think prides are at hugely different states of development all the way around the world. And to some extent, we owe it to be a big, brash, loud, political and fun pride to show those other prides that you can do that, but you don't have to become purely commercial. I mean, to be honest, there are some in the States now that I just find completely overwhelming and overly commercialised. I mean, it's quite a laugh when you've got Nando's there, all of their staff wearing a t-shirt saying Nando's worth coming out for. They do. And believe me, I make good use of those free chicken vouchers. But it can be overwhelmingly commercial sometimes, and I think we just need to keep those two spirits together. I don't know what you think. We were talking earlier about having been to San Francisco as well as some of the small ones.
Yeah. I mean, I celebrated a birthday whose number will remain nameless. That's my main connection to Pride, actually. It almost always coincides with my birthday, which I think is marvellous, because it's in the middle of the summer and there's nothing else going on. So in 2013 we were in San Francisco for San Francisco Pride, and I was so excited about it because it was my birthday, and it was touted as the largest pride and the biggest pride and the best pride, and I've been to London a few times, Nottingham a couple of times, which I really love, by the way. And we arrived, and we had to buy tickets to allow us to be by the sort of pride, the parade route, which we thought was odd to begin with. Obviously we weren't marching, I don't know San Francisco at all, so we just sort of stood there and watched as it went by. And just this amazingly sanitised version of all the great and the good, and everybody who ever wanted to run for political office who thought that it's a good idea to get in with the gayers. And it just went on, and there didn't seem to be any involvement from the actual community. And I thought, well, firstly, where are all the gay people? I don't know what, I have a feeling that all of these people waving from cars, I think they're straight. I can't be absolutely sure, but I'm flipping through the programme, straight. Gay ally, yeah, that's important. Ally's brilliant, but it's our pride, what are you doing? And eventually I think we just gave up. And wandered off and spent the rest of the day in our own devices, because it was just so huge, so commercialised, so sanitised, and so very deeply controlled that it had lost every semblance of any kind of demonstration. And it might well have been, an American Thanksgiving parade or any other parade for that matter. You wouldn't have known the difference. So, not my best pride. But London's not like that. London has never been like that, and I'm hoping that London will never be like that either. Because just last year when I got out there and for the first time ever marched with the trans community, FTM London came out along with some people from Press for Change and London, Trans London, and we all sort of marched together, and it felt like the protest again, it felt like the demonstration again, and it felt like there was something that we were marching for. We're nowhere near having equal rights, and I'm not just talking trans people, I'm talking LGBT community in general, but especially the trans community. We're nowhere near equality, we're nowhere near having discrimination abolished from our minds and hearts. We're nowhere near liberation, as Peter says, and until we get there, we better march, and march hard.
So that's actually... You led it perfectly to my next question, which was going to be, some people feel equality has already been achieved in the UK and believe we don't need pride anymore. And what would you say to them? You're wrong. Phil, your view on that? Do you feel we've reached equality?
I definitely don't. I think we've come a very, very long way, but we can't afford, as we always say, to be complacent. There is so much to do. When we have racism and fascism and even, you know, other forms of discrimination within our own LGBT community, and these things have to be addressed, and we mustn't be frightened to talk about them. We've got a long way to go, and only by challenging, only by putting our head above the parapet, only by coming together collectively and having a strong voice and turning up the volume on society and letting people know that we're here, by going into schools and challenging mindsets, you know, because I've always said, no child is born homophobic, Islamophobic, racist, sexist, you know, transphobic. It's all a learned and taught behaviour. So part of the education and awareness has to start within our schools. And until we have an equal footing, where there are no glass ceilings or sticky floors, where people can actually go for promotion and to be equal in a place that means that I have the same rights that you do, it means we've still got a long way to go. There may be a lot of things that may not change in my current lifetime, but if there's something I can do to leave a legacy of the things I do in being an activist, that's certainly what I want to do, so that my children and my children's children can benefit and reap the joys, and as a young black lady that she is, can say, you know what, I can be the next Prime Minister if I want to of this country. That is what equality is about, not being tokenistic, but making sure that there is a space for everybody to be and be who they want to be. That wasn't a motion, that was a question.
Peter, the definition of equality over the years, has it manifested, and what does it mean to you? What did it mean to you possibly 30 years ago? What does it mean to you today?
Well, as I said, in the days of the Gay Liberation Front in the early 1970s, the word equality never passed our lips. We didn't want to be equal within a fundamentally unjust society. We wanted to transform society for the benefit of LGBTI people and our straight friends and allies. So our quest was liberation, emancipation. And we took the view that if you simply ask for equality, what you're saying is you accept the status quo and you simply want parity within it. The Gay Liberation Front view and the later outrage view was we question the status quo. We don't accept it. We take a skeptical attitude. We want to transform it for everyone's benefit. So even if you look at legal equality today, you know, we have made fantastic strides, undoubtedly, and that's a great tribute to the tens of thousands of LGBTI people and our straight friends and allies around the country who have lobbied and campaigned, not for years, but for decades. But still, in terms of legal equality, we've got same-sex marriage, but obviously it's not equal marriage. There's still a ban on same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland, but even in England and Wales, we have marriage under a separate law. We've got marriage segregation. There's the 1949 Marriage Act, which is for straight couples only, and there's the 2013 Marriage Act, which is for same-sex couples only. So there's two mutually exclusive marriage laws. And then there's all other problems. You know, there's the spousal veto, which affects trans people in relationships and marriages. There's the inequality in pension inheritance and entitlement on the death of a partner. There are lots of areas where it isn't really true equality. And I always argued, and other people in outrage argued, that all the government had to do was to repeal the ban on same-sex marriage under the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973 and revert to the 1949 Marriage Act, which has no prohibition on same-sex marriage. The ban was only introduced in 1971. and then transferred to the Matrimonial Causes Act in 1973. So there's no need for a whole new legal framework. Other issues, Phil, mentions have been made of sex and relationship education. It's still not compulsory in all schools. And in most cases, it's not LGBTI inclusive. And that's why such high proportions of young LGBTI and straight kids say that their sex and relationship education was inadequate in all respects, but particularly did not address LGBTI issues. And right now, as you know, there's a big push to get mandatory sex and relationship education, which is inclusive of LGBTI issues. But I'd like to see what you mentioned, equality and diversity lessons in every school to challenge all forms of prejudice, not just homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, but racism, misogyny, prejudice against disabled people, travellers, and so on. Those kinds of lessons can really make a difference. And then there's just the news from the National AIDS Trust this week that HIV prevention has been cut from 55 million to 15 million, when we still have so many young people, or people of all ages, becoming newly infected, not getting tested, not getting early treatment. Then there's the blood ban. 12 months are totally unnecessary. It could be easily reduced to 6 months, even 3 months, even maybe 1 month in certain circumstances, if it was based more on individual assessment rather than generalisation. And then final point I make is LGBTI asylum seekers still not getting fair treatment, still being refused, still being humiliated. So you're absolutely right, there is more work to be done.
Well, yeah, I am very much with Peter on this one. I'm afraid I think that people who want equality lack ambition. I really do think of equality, even though I was one of the founders of Stonewall, and I think equality was what they went for and it was absolutely right. I kind of think of it like Tesco value products. It's there as the staple. And then you want some nice stuff that actually helps you celebrate and eat things you like on top of it. For me, that's actually one of the reasons why Pride is so important, is because it's not just about nailing our equality rights. It's about celebrating our community in all of its different ways and all of its diversity. And I think that when we have got legal equality, which we're damn close to but not perfectly there, we still have a situation in which no young person has yet grown up thinking that it's absolutely normal and ordinary and everyday to be LGBT. Everybody is still growing up thinking they're a second-class citizen. We have worse health problems, huge health inequalities in the LGBT communities. We have huge mental health issues. We have dependency problems. We have so many other things. And for years, we've covered all this over because we thought people might think less of us for it. We have to uncover all of that and say we are worth not just the same laws as everybody else, but the same health as everybody else, the same rights to be happy as everybody else. And for me, that's a lot of what Pride is about. I have to say my favourite Pride ever, I think, was actually 1985, which was 30 years ago now. Not just for the fact that I actually managed to introduce Sandy Shaw on stage, who was one of my major pop heroines, but also because it was the year that the Dulais miners marched in, and that's going to happen again this year, and I'm going to burst into tears, it's going to be ridiculous. But, people came in, the miners' band came in, first time I'd ever really thought seriously about straight allies on the Pride March, and they marched with us, and that was absolutely brilliant. And then Divine went past on a barge in the middle of the Thames, shrieking into a microphone. And I remember the face of this young policeman who was trying to manage the crowd in Jubilee Gardens. And it had the miners on one side, Divine on another, and then the Beverley Sisters came on stage, which was probably his mum's favourite group from the 50s. And he just looked like he was having a complete breakdown of culture here. And then Jimmy Somerville got fed up with Divine because he decided he wasn't sufficiently respectful to women, and he was screaming abuse at him over the river. And it was just gorgeous, chaotic, everybody making their point, everybody actually, making a movement and making a community in a brilliant way. And as insanely chaotic as every Pride should be, as long as you're not one of the organisers.
So in terms of past Prides, and yes, it's different, and Peter, you've mentioned it and you've also picked on it, Lisa, is celebrating equality. And what your exact words were, people who want equality lack ambition. But there's also this celebrating differences. And over the years, how has that changed? And Peter's point about the legislative side, the legal equality, versus what happens when you step out your door, when you do come out, whether it's to your loved ones, in the workplace, and what role does sort of pride play in celebrating those differences? It's for you.
I think the thing we have to remember is that every pride is somebody's first. Every single year, it's not something we started doing in '72 and we're all now veterans at. Every single year, there's a load of people on every single Pride March for whom it's their first, for whom they're scared to take those first steps. And I think that's incredible, and that's a thread that runs through Pride over all the years. I do think, though, that we have got better at having the rows about diversity and sorting things out. Because in the old days, you'd have a row at Pride and it would go on, it would simmer for years and it wouldn't get resolved. And actually, one of the things that I respect and admire about the current people running Pride is they've wanted to tackle those issues head on. They don't want trans people to feel excluded and for the things to happen over the toilets that go wrong and things like that. They don't want any group to feel that Pride isn't part of them as well. And they don't get it perfect, they don't always get it absolutely right by any manner of means, but I've never seen a group of people who've tried harder to celebrate the diversity as well as the equality, and I really like that.
Fantastic. SJ, would you like to comment from a trans community perspective, and also somebody's first, and if they're thinking about it, what would you basically say to them?
Don't be afraid. Come out. Come out. I think that's taking that first step. The first step is that hardest first step. I think, I mean, I don't have any concrete evidence for this, but I believe that more and more, obviously as we know, the Stonewall riots were started by trans women, and sort of trans people were at the very forefront of the liberation movement. Before there was an LGBT anything, there were just these women throwing things at police officers. And then for a while, trans people felt increasingly disenfranchised and kind of wandered off and did their own thing. And I think that over the last few years, definitely 5 years or so, they're coming back. And every year there are more trans people at Pride. There are an increasing number of people who may have been coming to Pride for years but have never necessarily identified as trans, non-binary people, people who just think, excuse my French, fuck gender, and are just coming out for the sake of the diversity, because, coming back to it again, this is where you can be yourself. And the idea that, so for the person coming to Pride for the first time, don't, like Stephen Fry, worry about what you're wearing and how tie-dyed your pink shirt needs to be. Wear whatever makes you comfortable, be happy with however it is that you are. If you've always wanted to wear something, if you've always wanted to present in a certain way, but have never been able to do it at Pride. And nobody will care. I mean, everyone will care, because they'll go, good for you, brilliant, keep doing it. And then after that first step, once you've done it at Pride, you'll be able to keep doing it, and you'll be able to continue to live your life the way that you want to live it, and then you'll come back to Pride the following year going, oh, well, this is pretty normal now. I've kind of shifted the way I thought, and before I thought this was normal, now I think that that's normal. Tomorrow, who knows what normal might be, and, fuck gender, fuck normal, and take it from there, come out.
Thank you.
That answered the question at all.
Yes, in a roundabout way, it's very good. Phil, we spoke about the multiple layers of diversity and your personal experience. So also taking a look at it from a woman's perspective, the black woman's perspective, and you know, also looking at it as a lesbian. What would you also say to someone who is potentially also having those multiple layers and fighting their way through their personal lives, their professional lives, potentially even their identity?
If I could go back all of those years ago when I attended my first Pride, and knowing that I've always been a black activist, I've always fought for, you know, for rights. But if I could go back and say to the me that was then, it's okay to be who you are. As you said, SJ, don't be afraid, but I wouldn't necessarily say come out, because there's differences and there's different challenges that people face. It's not just about coming out, it's about having a safe space to be. And that's what Pride was for me. It was a safe space, not just to come out and to sing it from the rooftops, because there are different factors which come into play culturally, in terms of religion, in terms of belief, in terms of, you know, some of the difficulties of being a migrant, or even coming over to this country and being an asylum seeker or a failed asylum seeker. So it wouldn't be just come out, but come with me and have a safe space to celebrate who you are, and let's take this journey together. I wished that there was a number of people who were there to hold my hand and guide me through the journey that I was going through. Because of coming out and attending my first Pride, I was a survivor of domestic violence, a survivor. And that was of coming out and wanting to be me. So yeah, Pride means safety, it means family, it means security, it means being, it means coming out. And I have to refer to UK Black Pride, because that was the first time I really, really enjoyed Pride. And, you know, people in the LGBT community have said to me, why on earth do we need a Black Pride? It's not necessary. You're a separatist. In fact, they called me racist, and I, you know, didn't want to pick up the dictionary and tell them what racism means and talk about the superiority and the, you know, and things that align with it. But Black Pride for me meant that there were people there who understood part of my journey. It doesn't mean that London Pride, Brighton Pride, Manchester Pride, Birmingham Pride doesn't, but that shared commonality of having faith and belief, being a black woman who was an activist, who still is, and there's just so much about who I am and who people are, that we're not just LGBTIQ people. There's so much, in this room there is so much diversity, and we cannot just say that we're lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And that is what UK Black Pride sets out to do, change the narrative and celebrate who we are, all of those different multiple identities, layers, whatever you wish to call it, whether it's the intersections and what crosses over. It's about just being and being who we are. So when people say there should not be a Black Pride, do I then say, well then why on earth do we have a Pride at all? Because it started from somewhere, and the movement of UK Black Pride started as a frustration from many of the black LGBT people that I had spoken to, that had been part of the movement, that had seen the movement change, was a frustration of not being visible and being present. So UK Black Pride is not a separate pride, it's part of the Pride family, and it welcomes its doors, opens its doors to absolutely everybody. And I think one thing that London Pride did was to show society, and they made such a huge change. And I do get quite emotional about this, because when we started, we went round with our begging bowl, you know, trying to have a space. We took people to Southend, and, you know, it worked, it didn't, we had coaches, and London Pride, after having the doors shut down on us by older board members of London Pride, not the current London Pride as it stands, somebody in London Pride told one of our colleagues to F off. There's no space for a black pride. So to hear that in our own LGBT community, that is why UK Black Pride exists today and will continue to, because there's a long way to go. And yes, people who do ask for equality may be lacking in something, but at the same time, when all you have is to ask for equality, because black people or people of colour, and I say black within its political context, have been asking for so much because there has been a back foot. There's not just the issue of being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. There's also the inherent racism. There's the hierarchical structure of people coming over. But anyways, I don't wish to sort of get deep-rooted, but I just wanted to explain that we cannot say that there shouldn't be something, or we shouldn't have self-organised groups. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. Our movement started as a frustration. Our movement as LGBT people started as a being of wanting to be visible. And that's what other pockets of our communities are asking for.
And that's Peter, that's part of the natural evolution, or whether it's been more organised. And in your role specifically, you know, campaigning for human rights, for LGBT rights, tackling Islamophobia, taking a look at, you know, what Phyll has been explaining, you know, there was just someone to hold my hand, guide me. And it's on so many different areas, and just looking up the definition of racism and what that potentially made you feel. A lot of things that we're talking about here are feelings as well. And I'd like to sort of ask for you to comment, because I saw you taking some notes, so I'd like for you to continue on and comment on what Phyll was also saying.
Yeah, I think Phyll raises very valid points, which can and should be addressed by Pride. So I'd like to see Pride, this is not meant to be a negative criticism, but a constructive proposal, Pride to give a much higher profile to marginalised groups within our community, both near the front of the march and on the main stage, to give voices to Afro-Caribbean LGBT people, African LGBT people, Muslim LGBT people, trans LGBT people, and so on. We need to make those groups, or give those groups a platform to speak, and we need to give them prominence to show that we are committed and that their voices will be heard. I'd also like to think that perhaps Pride should be making a greater effort to involve non-LGBTI communities. Like, wouldn't it be great if some of the Muslim organisations could be invited to be, not the LGBTI ones, the mainstream Muslim organisations can be invited to be part of Pride and to speak. Maybe they won't accept, but I think we should reach out to them. And the same with black and ethnic minority organisations. Reach out to them to get them involved, because their communities are part of our communities. It isn't like the LGBTI community here and the black community there. Some of our own members are, you know, in the LGBTI community are black and ethnic minority, and in the black and ethnic minority community, some of their members are LGBTI. So I think that's another issue. And the final point I'd make is I do think that I can understand why general themes like freedom to be are chosen, but I don't really think they work. I think you need a specific theme to galvanise and mobilise people, and to use Pride as a platform for an agenda. And right now the big issue is mandatory sex and relationship education inclusive of LGBTI people. There are other issues, lots of other issues as well, but that is the big political issue at the moment, and I would like to see this year's Pride put that at the forefront so that we can send a message to our community and to the wider society, and hopefully get media coverage, that this is an important and legitimate human rights demand, that LGBTI kids deserve respect and support in the school, and that they deserve sex and relationship education that addresses their particular circumstances. It's just an idea, but I just think the specific approach is going to get more media coverage. Because the media, if you just have a march and it's just freedom too, the media can say, oh, it's just another pride. But if the media gets the message, this is about, whatever the issue, it might be trans issues, it may be HIV education and prevention. If you've got an issue, and you do the research and provide the spokespeople in the background, you're much more likely to get media coverage.
Thank you, Peter. I have a question for Lisa and then for SJ. Lisa, the question is, do you agree with Peter about having a mandatory specific theme and not having something along the lines of freedom too? And SJ, you spoke about allies. And Peter has spoken about the importance of bringing in different ally organisations. Do you agree? So Lisa, if you could go first, please.
I was listening to Peter say that and I was thinking, I love, please don't be offended by this, Peter, you know what I mean. I love old activists like me and Peter, who we're campaigners, we want to do something specific, we want to make that change. And that's part of that desire to have that very specific campaign is that. And what I always have to remind myself is that every time you decide on one specific campaign, you exclude a whole bunch of other people. And I didn't like Freedom 2 as a campaign, but I think it worked. And it's created quite a lot of buzz, it created quite a lot of attention. And so I understand why Pride chooses to have a theme that everybody can find their own way into and get behind. I don't think either way is more laudable. I think it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. And I think while Pride is trying to become more inclusive and more diverse, that it probably needs to have themes that everyone can find their own way into. Now, I think everybody ought to find their own way into same-sex SRE, but let's face it, there's quite a lot of people who don't, including all of the political parties have failed to do stuff about this when they could have at various points. So, I have extreme personal sympathy with Peter's view, but I know exactly why Pride does what it does, and I suspect it works better. It's really annoying that life is like that, but I'm a utopian.
Question on allies and the inclusion of allies alongside Pride.
I mean, first of all, I agree with Lisa. I'd probably say that a lot. I'm actually wondering on a sort of practical perspective, how it would work. On one hand, let's say that next year we did do an SRE-focused Pride, and we also invited to said Pride all of the Muslim and Christian and other groups who may be incredibly opposed to exactly the SRE education for the various religion reasons that they might have. I have a feeling that either they wouldn't turn up or the SRE thing would die. So I'm not sure practically how, I'm sure that you didn't mean at the same time, Peter, I'm just being facetious. Allies are great. We like allies. My sort of immediate worry with inviting groups who do not identify in any way as LGBTIQ or whatever acronym is that you might end up with a San Francisco situation where, you know, everybody who's in any way trying to court the gay vote or the pink pound or whatever it is, that people who don't care about our issues and are not actually interested in engaging with us want that same day, and they would sort of hijack our agenda in favour of their agenda while making out as though they're being inclusive. So I would say that you would have to be extraordinarily cautious about that, because if we do start sort of tipping the other way and suddenly finding that the majority of, you know, gay pride is straight, then you do wonder what you're doing. I know that Peter's had a tough week, especially with regards to allies. the thing about allies is that you can be an absolutely superb ally until the moment that it all goes horribly wrong. But allies ultimately, and this is the important thing about allies, is that they have to take a back seat. LGBT people have always ran the movement, the community, Pride, and must, and this is absolutely vital, must continue to run it until Pride is no longer needed, no longer relevant. We mustn't be letting people from outside into our safe spaces, because that's what they are safe spaces. And we must ensure that we keep control of that. And if allies at any point are trying to make out as though their issues and their feelings are more important than ours, then they've lost the plot, and they've lost us, and they will have lost Pride. And I think that what we're doing here is far too important to risk that. So invite the allies, but make them sit at the back.
Thank you, SJ. Okay, as the moderator, I also have the additional role of timekeeper. So to sort of say we are drawing towards the end of the panel discussion. We will be opening up shortly for Q&A, but just before that I want to say a few words, and then I'd like each panelist to also tell me something, a point in time in your past Pride, something that has touched you, that has impacted you, that has led to something that changed in you. So what I've gathered from today, and I've sort of put some notes down, and what really touched me, gave me goosebumps. Every Pride is somebody's first. Don't be afraid. It's okay to be who you are. Even with legal equality, we have a lot to do. Pride is a sense of family, security, a safe space. Hold my hand and guide me, the past, present, and our future. So I'd like to start with those personal stories. Phil, do you do me the honor to go first?
Yeah. My personal story is one of having our very first Black Pride and realising as we're stood in Southend looking over the water, and there were 3 young men that entered into our safe Pride space and called us the N-word, the B-words, and told us to F off and go back to where we came from. I looked around and there was over 500 people of colour, BME people, white people, our allies, because sometimes you just don't know who's who, and we had a voice, and we were able to turn around and run them out of our space, and it was our space. And it was from that moment that a few of the women who had gone through what's called the fast track system in the asylum process said, oh my gosh, this is the first time I've travelled in the UK, and if this is what Pride is about, I want to celebrate it every single day. And you've given me a platform to be visible and to be heard 365 days of the year, 24/7. That made me cry uncontrollably. I lost my eyelashes. I was wearing contact lenses. It was a moment that I hold with me, because no amount of money can you put on a moment when somebody feels safe to be them, and because they were coming from a country, a place where they cannot be themselves. So proud to be me, and that be me was about BME, Black and Minority Ethnic. It was about that empowerment, that uplifting. It was about that liberation. It was about that struggle. But every single person who was celebrating Pride at that moment realised that we were strong and we had strength in numbers, and solidarity was shown right throughout. And that was what was important for me.
Wow. Lisa, blow me away.
I think the one that always sticks out for me is an intensely personal one, actually, which was in the early 80s. I know it was then because I was a columnist for Capital Gay, which you may remember, which Michael Mason, the owner and editor of, died last week, and I think we need to pay a tribute to him because he, like Peter, was part of the GLF youth group, was very instrumental in those early marches and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I was writing columns for him at the time, which is why I remember it had to be the early 80s. And I was depressed that week because my cat had run away and I hadn't seen it for 4 days, and I was thinking, oh my God, it's a pair of fur gloves by now. And I went on Pride. I didn't want to go on Pride. I was like, oh, I'm not feeling at all prideful today. But I went on the march and I was halfway down it, and I saw a little placard that said Croydon Area Gay Society. Now, that might not seem particularly impressive now, but then, for a girl from Croydon who'd never been able to come out in Croydon, whose best friend's brother went queer bashing every weekend outside the only gay pub in Croydon, for me to see that there was a Croydon Area Gay Society, I just burst into tears on that march, because I thought if I was a kid growing up in Croydon now, I'd have somewhere to go. I'd have a different role model of some description. And that turned around that Pride for me. And then when I got home, the cat was waiting on the doorstep as well, so...
Esther, your personal story.
I think I'm going to tell the one I told Lisa earlier, so sorry about that. It's sort of personal for me. I was a volunteer on an LGBT helpline, and a couple of weeks before Pride, I'm going to say 2012, I got a call from a mum of a child who was telling me how she thought that her son might be gay, and he hadn't spoken to her, he hadn't told her anything about it, so she couldn't be entirely sure, but she wanted to know how she could support him, what kind of books he might like to read, who the kind of role models would be. So we got, you know, a little bit of gay history, gay icons in over the phone, and I started doing what you do on the helplines, which is look at the database and see what there is available, and sort of bringing up all of the youth groups in the area. And I said to her, okay, well, some of these youth groups are for slightly older kids and some of them are for slightly younger kids, so how old is your son? And she said, he's 8. And I thought, oh hell, I've got nowhere to send you. Well, that was my first thought. The second thought was, I think everyone should have a mum like you. And I think I even told her that. So I said to her, well, unfortunately, all of the youth groups, even the ones who take the youngest kids, will start at age 10, 11, 12. So there's really not much out there. But I'll tell you what, Pride's coming up. You can go out with him, you can take him along, it's incredibly family friendly. There'll be lots of people out with their kids. It'll either be, you know, gay people with their children. Do gay people have children? Yes, yes they do. And or it can be, you know, young gay people coming with their parents. It's an incredibly open and safe environment to be. And she went, all right, thanks a lot. I'll see, you know, we'll see about looking into that. And a couple of weeks went by and I went to Pride, and obviously I will never know whether or not she was there. But as every year with Pride, to me it's always about the children. I see the kids and I see the parents who are proud to be there with their kids, and to me that's the biggest sign of change. It shows us that people are unafraid to take their children. You know, gay people are not something to be feared, with something to have fun with, as we said. And obviously I always cry with all the kids, and I do still think of that mum. and you know, hope that her son got something out of it, and obviously that she got something out of it too.
Lovely. Pride always about the children. Peter, your personal impactful story.
There have been so many. I think one thing that recurs and has been recurring over the last 40 plus years I've been going to Pride is when people from some small town or village where they've often suffered great ostracism and discrimination and even violence comes to Pride and feels safe and so joyful to be with other LGBTI people and be accepted. You know, I can think of so many examples of where just someone's come up to me at a Pride parade and told me this story. Similarly, from people from overseas, you know, looking back over the years, people from South Africa under apartheid, from Zimbabwe during the heyday of Mugabe's terrorization of the LGBT community, Palestine, Russia, Latvia, the list is endless. And what is even better is when I get an email from them, maybe 1 to 5 or 10 years later, and saying, I was so happy to join you at that Pride parade. Being there with so many other LGBT people gave me real strength and hope. I've now organised a Pride parade in my country. And that was the case in Russia, in Latvia, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. To think that our Pride parade helped give people the confidence, the inspiration to go and organise their own and do wonderful, amazing things, often under conditions of much greater adversity. You know, in poor developing countries, in countries where there's great oppression, both political repression and homophobic repression, it's really, really difficult. And, you know, to get those emails that they've done something, and despite all the odds, that's really, really inspiring. It makes me think and have the confidence to say that queer freedom is going global, that LGBTI people worldwide are organising and we're winning. And we know there is a backlash, but it's only in about 15 or 20 countries. It's terrible that there's a backlash at all, but it's only in about 15 to 20 out of 193 countries. And it's an enormous tribute to those LGBTI campaigners in those countries who, despite all the odds, have gone ahead and done it and are really making great changes.
Fantastic. Okay, like absolute clockwork, Phew, it's 8:10 on the dot. We have 15 minutes for Q&A. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and one of our volunteers will make their way to you with a microphone. Yes, shall we start with the gentleman at the back? And no questions about the missing pussycat or the eyelashes, yeah?
Good evening. Just a quick question and a comment at the same time. We've talked a lot about identity and celebrating our differences, which is very important. But it seems that sometimes we are missing as well as celebrating our common humanity that we share around everybody else. Do you think that's something that needs to be addressed?
Peter, would you like to take that? Oh, also, if you have a question specific for one of the panelists, please can you mention that at the start? Thank you.
Well, you're right. I mean, despite our differences, which we celebrate and value, we do have a common bond, a common interest in working together to challenge all forms of prejudice and discrimination. And that's not just within the bounds of the LGBTI community, but within wider society. To go back to the early 1970s, in the early 1970s, there's a very famous trial of black activists called the Mangrove Nine, who were framed by the police. The Gay Liberation Front, because we supported all liberation struggles, we went along to that protest in support of the Mangrove Nine. And we didn't know what kind of reaction we would get. And I've got to tell you that initially, there were quite a lot of askance looks, and they weren't all friendly. But we had a dialogue. And by the end of it, we got, thank you for coming along. Thank you for recognising that the world doesn't just involve homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, it also involves racism, police harassment. And that was part of a connection that led to a great deal of solidarity between the black and gay communities in the early 1970s. Some of you know that the main gay commune was in Railton Road, on the front line in Brixton, next to all the black activists. And there was this real solidarity, black and gays unite, stand together, recognise that within both our communities we have LGBTI and black. So I'd say that that issue about our common humanity is something we mustn't lose sight of. And sometimes we do over-highlight the differences to the exclusion of our common humanity, and it's only through our common humanity and working together that we can make change. I mean, LGBTI people are a minority. We need straight allies to help us win.
Thank you. We had a question, the gentleman right next to the pillar.
Sorry. Hi. I remember coming down to London for my first Pride March when I was 16 years old, back in the 80s, when everyone came to London on coaches and buses and have you, and it was real spirit in Jubilee Gardens, as we were saying. Sorry, my voice as we were going. Nowadays, it just seems that there's lacking that community feel. You know, maybe it's got a wee bit too big, a wee bit too commercialised. And I've been involved over the years, be it from the rugby team, be it from the Buddhism, be it for the local community group in Southwark or Lambeth, whatever it may be. And there just seems to be less and less people that I know willing to take part in actually getting involved in London Pride, and they're more willing to go to the local smaller prides across the UK, where they feel there's actually more community involvement. How can we manage to get that community spirit back and ensure that it doesn't actually end up being commercialised, as mentioned with San Francisco earlier?
Is there a question for the whole panel? Or?
I kind of feel that's a question for Pride rather than necessarily for us. I think that there is a need to spread stuff out, and actually there is a need for those local prides to get supported as well. I think the biggest problem that London faces is actually the insistence that it goes into Trafalgar Square these days and Soho, which isn't particularly friendly for people who aren't part of the scene. And Trafalgar Square has as many tourists as there is LGBT people watching what's going on. So I think I would like to see Pride get imaginative about where it goes and what it can do. And I know some of that's tied up with relationships with GLA and things like that. But I think you talk about the mid-80s and Jubilee Gardens and things. I think Pride needs to get back to being in a park or being in a big area. And there you can have a lot more diverse things going on, frankly. There are a lot of different things in Trafalgar Square, but you can't get round them because you can't bloody move.
Would anyone else like to comment further on that?
Yeah, just to say that I think I know it's very difficult to include absolutely everyone without somebody getting upset that you may have missed them out. But a point that Robert makes so poignantly is that we do try and include everybody. We do try and make and create that space. And I think probably we're in a very unique position of being UK Black Pride, is that we do have our Pride in a park, and we make sure that we have, whether it's a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Sikh, and some of those allies from those communities who are not necessarily LGBT present at Pride. And it's important that they have a space to, whether it's chant or whether it's take themselves somewhere and speak their language. And I think that what we sometimes do, and where you mentioned over highlighting particular groups, we've got to a stage now where sometimes people are trying to out-trump each other with their disadvantage, and that is so dangerous. You know, so that person's disabled, LGBT, so it must be more important than the racism that a black LGBT person will suffer, or that person's trans, that must be more important. So rather than out-trumping each other with our disadvantage, it's about looking at how we can come together, and it goes back to the point the young man made at the back, that shared commonality, but in terms of just the voice of humanity. We're not there yet, but we have to try and look at how we learn from each other and not be frightened of talking about these things, because I do think sometimes we are frightened to put things out there on the table in case we're accused of talking about being too black. That can't happen. In case you didn't know I'm black. I thought I'd come out here.
So just want a show of hands. We've got about time for another 4 or 5 more questions. You are next in the black shirt. Yes, you are next. I also had a hand in the middle. Yes, and yourself in yes. Okay.
Hi everyone. I'm in London since '96. So I've been a London volunteer for the past 8 years. And I would actually like to see a few things happening to Pride. First of all, I can imagine we already have the stage on Saturdays. Why not open it up on Fridays and have like comedy and maybe fashion shows from Prowler, Clone Zone? Yeah, have a nice evening to get into Saturday. But also I would like a moment where we actually commemorate people that we've lost, maybe within the festival. Pride Festival in Cologne and Frankfurt are over 3 days. Cologne has a candle-lit vigil. Frankfurt has got balloon release. I can, for example, imagine a rainbow with balloons building up across Trafalgar Square and then being released to commemorate of all the people that we've lost. And there's so many people that we've lost within our community, down to HIV, hepatitis C, breast cancer, suicide, homophobia, you know, the list goes on, and I think we should actually kind of show some respect and also channel that out and, you know, show people that we've come a long way, and we must remember also people that we've lost.
Thank you for your suggestions to Pride. Do you have a question for the panelists? No.
Do you agree?
Can I just say, I think, okay, I'm hoping that it still runs, but there's a gentleman called Mark Healy, who does run an LGBT Day of Remembrance event. It's in November, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. October, thank you. The year that I was at it, I was actually playing with the London Gay Symphonic Winds, and it was really, really lovely, and actually it was really nice to have something that was dedicated to that particular moment, and that because it was sparked by a few very specific events that were happening in London at the time. So I think it was 2008 or so. My history's not so good. But there is a dedicated event for these things, and I'm sure someone can find you the details if you.
Should it be included?
Um,
That's the black one.
Yeah.
It's like saying, you know, Black Pride, keep it separate. If you have it together, it's inclusive.
I think it depends on your idea of what Pride is for, which I suppose is what we've been talking about today, isn't it? If you see it as a kind of a celebration of who we are, that doesn't exclude the possibility of being able to commemorate what we've lost and remember the people that we love and have lost. But from a practical perspective, and again, people correct me if I'm wrong, a couple of years ago, maybe more than a couple, there was an attempt to run Pride as a Pride weekend, definitely Friday and Saturday, if not Friday as well. It utterly tanked. The Pride lost a lot of money that year. It was commercially completely unviable, and I'm not making any excuses for them because I wasn't involved. I've never been involved in the organisation of Pride, but I think that's why that was eventually decided to not be a good idea. People didn't want to kick up on a Sunday. They were too hungover from Saturday.
Okay, our next question.
My name is Shane. Peter talked about how Pride in London has inspired people elsewhere abroad to take up the challenge and organise their own prides and bring that to their communities. I wanted to just make a brief remark about the impact that Pride in London as a national pride has had on regional prides, and I was one of the co-organisers over 30 years ago in 1981 of the first Pride in Aberdeen, and that was a tough call, but we got through it, and I'm sure the city's a happier place for it. But I just want to ask a purely anecdotal level, because I remember, if any of the panellists remember, the year that Pride in London, i.e. the national Pride, decided it wasn't going to occur in London. Instead, if I recall, we were going to go to Huddersfield, yes, because some punter had got sacked or there was some homophobic incident. And so instead of doing the usual stuff, having fun in London, we all got onto coaches. It was absolutely miserable weather. We got to march up a fairly derelict high street alongside a public that was unsympathetic and bemused to a large degree, and the sort of social environments and places that we wanted to be were virtually non-existent. Now, I remember that as being a vanguardist pride to change the world, and I was happy to be there, but it certainly was a standout pride. So I wonder if anybody anecdotally remembers that one.
1981.
1981, thank you.
I'll never forget that bloody pink Rolls Royce or whatever it was. Yeah.
I'm from Huddersfield, it's lovely.
And I moved to Aberdeen as the first city when I moved to this country, so...
Well, I do want to make a response to that, which is I think it's incredibly important that prides support each other and that we do have prides in other places, because I live in Cardiff now, not in London, and we are celebrating this year the 30th anniversary of our first Pride March there in 1985, which was organised by someone who'd come up from London and thought every town ought to have a Pride. But they marched from the only gay pub in town to the Students' Union fairly fast, because it was the only two places they could guarantee they wouldn't get beaten up. But they did it, and some of them are still around to tell that story now. We've got a big History Month meeting about it on Saturday. Every town should have their pride of some description.
Lovely. Okay, our next question, please, and if you could make it brief.
Hi. I just want to speak up on pride and equality, really. I really connected with what Peter and SJ said earlier about battles is a big word, but the steps which need to be taken to reach true equality, particularly around asylum seekers and in instances where the devil's in the detail with the spousal veto. Yet, I can't help but feel that in the circles that I hang around in and the wider sphere, equality is achieved and people overlook these issues. How can Pride galvanise people into noticing the nuance which still needs to be approached, and what can be done so that the issues are still kept on the table when they're not as buzzworthy as past issues?
Peter, would you like to start answering that, and then any of the other panelists wish to jump in, please do.
I think there is a certain degree of apathy and complacency. At one level, that's understandable. You know, the ferocity of anti-LGBTI oppression is nowhere near as great as it once was. So people who had lived through that, for many of them, it's a different world today. You know, a much better, more comfortable, safer world. I think we know there are still problems, but a lot of people think, well, yeah, there are these issues that are unresolved, but give it time, they will be resolved. And at one level, they're probably right. You know, probably eventually over time, these other issues will be resolved, but probably not without some driving campaign to push them forward. And the trouble is today, you know, we do have some campaigns that do galvanise people. That's great. But many people just think, you know, it'll happen in due course. And I think that's dangerous because change doesn't happen by itself. It takes people willing to stand up and be counted and to push things forward. I think when it comes to the remaining business, even if we did get to a state where we had absolute equality, where we had absolute social acceptance, that would be not a guarantee in perpetuity. It's very, very hard to imagine how things could be rolled back in the future. I can't imagine it right now. But who can say what might happen in 10, 20, 30, 50 years' time? If we had a global economic crisis and meltdown, if we had runaway climate destruction, you know, you could bet there'd be people, new political movements arising to defend this country against all others, to invoke nationalism, and, as so often happens, to scapegoat and demonize minorities within. Now, I'm not saying it would be LGBTI people. Right now, it's immigrants and asylum seekers who are on the real brunt of xenophobia. But it's not inconceivable, and I always take the lesson from Germany. In 1930, Berlin was the queer capital of the world. You know, it was on the verge of repealing paragraph 175. There were LGBT organizations, campaigns, newspapers, sporting and cultural associations. Berlin was queer heaven on earth in 1930. Yet just 3 years later, the Nazis came to power and all that went into reverse. You know, within months of the Nazis coming to power, all the gay organizations and newspapers were banned, bars and clubs were closed down, and by the end of 1933, the first men were being carted off to concentration camps because they were gay or bisexual. So it's just a lesson that we should never assume that history is a unilinear process from, you know, the bad to the good. That we should always be vigilant, always defend and assert the rights we have, and keep pushing for the rights we haven't quite won.
I'm going to drag us back to the question for a minute, which is, I'm not sure it's Pride's role to educate people about all of the finer points of everything in all of the issues. I absolutely agree that it's Pride's job to create the spirit of Pride and an ability of people to stand up for ourselves. And I think it's very useful if Pride can provide a framework for those of us who have a specific issue that we want to educate people about, to do that through the events of Pride. But I actually think it's a sign of success of any given LGBT organisation that we start to say it should be doing everything. And that's usually the point where it keels over, stone dead. And it's only a couple of years since Pride in London nearly died and embarrassed us all hugely in the year when we were running was it Euro Pride or World Pride? How bad can it get? So please remember that this is a baby Pride. You talk about what other prides are doing. This is actually, in organisational terms, one of the newest prides, and I think it's incredible that we produce what we do, given that Pride in London has had to reinvent itself half a dozen times over the last 30 years, because it's keeled over for various reasons. So, you know, I think at the moment, I'm happy to see it able to walk before it gets to run.
Very, very quickly, I think your question was about how can we recognise the nuances. I think that there's something which is so simple that we need to do is that cross-working and speaking to each other, speaking to other, you know, other groups, other people. You know, no idea is a new idea. We need to start recognising that media has to change, that we have to speak to trade unions, that we speak to Stonewall, because now they're going through a massive change in including tea. It's just speaking, and you rightfully pointed out, it's about your struggle has to be my struggle, and my struggle has to be your your struggle, only then are we going to recognise that we have a shared commonality and we're able to trundle through and challenge.
Okay, wonderful. Our last question. I hope you can talk really quickly. You've got 10 seconds.
Okay, I'll be as quick as I can. Firstly, from someone who worked in the political system, I think Peter's absolutely right. Clamouring around a single issue works. It fits in with the way social media is. It fits in with the way MPs are, where they can bring bills. And just the general appetite of the country is a lot easier to fit around a single issue. But more importantly, I'm sorry to end it on this note, that SJ, I'm a little worried by some of the language that you use, talking about people hijacking pride, such as straight allies or politicians. Yeah, there's some bad politicians who do want to use pride cynically, but there's also some very good ones out there who are there for a good reason. And I just feel that you're in danger with some of that language of turning pride into a bit of a closed shop, when the whole idea of it is to try and make it equal.
Could you elaborate on when you're saying hijacking pride? I don't really recall that being said exactly.
No, not the exact quote, but I think I'm happy for SJ to come back on this. Is that she was, I think when Peter mentioned the issue of straight allies, I think pride should be opened out. I play for a gay-friendly football team, and the key words in that are gay-friendly. It's not a closed shop. It's not only gays. I mean, the way SJ would be that essentially all the straight guys in that gay-friendly football team would be on the bench.
SJ, would you like to comment?
I'd just like to see your response to that.
Yep, firstly, you weren't to know, but my pronouns are they, so for future reference. With regard to hijacking, I did say it, Humour, I hold up my hands, I did. We have to remember that Pride is not the only LGBT-related thing out there. If we want to look at issues and we want to campaign on issues, and there are issues that Pride isn't picking up on, why not Stonewall? Or any other of the many campaigning organisations that are out there. But I think on that point earlier that Pride does have a part to play in the campaign. But as for the allies hijacking the movement, what I was trying to say was that your gay-friendly football team is not going to end up with the straight players on the bench, because it's set out as a gay-friendly football team. It's an inclusive football team, and they were starting off with a mixture of straight and gay players. Now, Pride, and Peter will correct me if I'm wrong, started out as a movement of some pretty committed, pretty angry gay people who had a good right to be angry. And, if straight people had come in at that point and said, calm down, dear, then there probably would have been more riots than there actually were. And so, to me, the spirit of Pride is about that. It is for LGBT people. It is for, and I worry less about the hijacking, maybe more about the dilution. I don't want to exclude anyone. I would never want to exclude anyone. It's about the people who are leading the movement. It's about, and this is one of the things that I'm really committed to, because I think that one of the things that Pride could do to highlight the issues is that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have no voice, who have no megaphone, who are just standing there and shouting in the dark. And I think that one of the things that Pride could do for them is to hand them that megaphone and say, here it is, say what you need to say. And I worry that, if you start giving that megaphone even for 1 second to somebody who's not of us, then that megaphone won't come back. Maybe I'm just paranoid. It is possible. And I want to work with politicians. I think, if we're not working with politicians and we're not working with government, then no change will ever happen. But I think that there's a time for protest, there's a time for lobbying, and there's a time for collaboration. And actually, Pride is none of those things. It's time for celebration.
Thank you, SJ. So on that note, I would like to announce that the panel is officially closed. Please, a round of applause for I'd like to invite Stephen Ward, our Vice Chair of Pride London, to say a few words and officially close this event.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming along this evening, and I hope you will join me in thanking my colleague, Huma, for running the session so brilliantly. And for our fantastic panellists. I think they really show the meaning of the phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants. I've actually got quite a tough job, not least because I've got a bit of a frog in my throat, because I've been suffering from a cold for the last billion years, it seems like. Pride's got an awful lot to do, judging from this conversation. I work in the legal sector and I run a group for gay lawyers. And we often talk about a simile of the world is like a zoo, but there's only a giraffe house in there, and the hippos aren't very well accommodated, and the penguins aren't very happy either, having to live in a giraffe house. It doesn't work very well. I think when Peter talks about the difference between equality and liberation, equality sees the hippos getting their wallowing pool and the penguins getting their cold swimming pool and so on. But I think what he wants us to aim for in liberation is to smash down the walls of the zoo, smash away the different houses, and let us all live free. I think that's something that, as I have become more of an activist, that's an agenda I personally have signed up to as well. But how are we going to get there? As always, in small steps, by making small differences in the way we live our lives, by the way that we bear witness to the past, and campaign for changing the future. We took over, as Lisa, I think, said, Pride in London 2 years ago. A classic example of being careful what you wish for. We put in a bid to run Pride and get funding from the GLA, and we were successful in that bid. I think if we'd known how challenging it is to run a parade through the centre of Europe's busiest shopping streets, a small bit of entertainment and some rousing speeches in Trafalgar Square, and keeping Soho safe with all the masses of people there, we might have thought a bit more carefully before embarking on this venture. But we have embarked on this venture. And I think one of the reasons we won this bid is because we put community at the heart of that bid. We promised to be a pride of, by, and for the LGBT+ community in London. And beyond, we're not arrogant as London Pride, and we're absolutely thrilled that some of the pressure has been taken off in terms of sheer numbers of people Pride in London, because there are these thriving prides around the country and growing that are giving visibility and campaigning platforms to people right where they live, rather than having to travel down to London to do that. This meeting is part of that commitment to community, part of that commitment to transparency. And next week we've got another open meeting, which is more about the nuts and bolts of planning for this year, where it's possible to put questions, suggestions, and we'll take away your ideas about different things to put on in Pride. But we've also had to make some choices, lots of choices. We're only 2 years old, we're a baby Pride. And it costs a phenomenal amount of money to run Pride in London and to keep it free. Because, we often compare to Brighton Pride, to Manchester Pride. They'll charge, there's a ticket price, there's an entry price. In London, it's free to take part. And that's absolutely a core commitment for us. So we've had to think about, well, what is Pride for? What can Pride do? It's a celebration. It's a political campaigning moment. It's creating a sense of solidarity. It's to support that person who'd come up from their small town in Suffolk, perhaps, perhaps excited for the first time to be in the majority for once. And so we have to be realistic about what we can achieve, and particularly in year 2, year 3, how much we can do. Pride is about visibility, giving us visibility as a community, giving people, individuals in the community, campaigning groups, sports societies, employee network groups, a platform from which to promote the causes that are dear to them. And I think it was SJ who mentioned the megaphone. We want to give each of those groups a megaphone at Pride in order to make their voices louder and to reach more people. It's a great opportunity to do that. And that's great, and that's great for the people who come along on the day. And I think last year we had 30,000, I know last year we had 30,000 people in the parade, and the crowds on the route were deeper than I've ever seen them. It was fabulous, despite the torrential rain, which gave up. And I should pay tribute to our volunteers at this point, because every volunteer I spoke to along that route, who had been soaked at 1 o'clock, was in good spirits. They were cheering the crowd along. They're doing really well. But we need to take pride out of that footprint. It's no good just talking to, let's say, 750,000 people who turn up for Pride in London, who fill Soho bars on the day, celebrate the campaign, all the rest of it. We need to reach out beyond that to our allies, to people who don't feel the courage even to come to Pride, to people who feel isolated in their communities, even in London. It's terribly easy for us to be complacent about living out gay lives in London. I won't embarrass one of my colleagues who's here tonight, but who got gay bashed last year before Pride in Camden. Unbelievable. Well, not actually, sadly, unbelievable. Very believable. And that's why we ran the Freedom 2 campaign last year, and why we're repeating it this year. And I know there's been a bit of sort of criticism here. It's too broad a theme, doesn't mean anything. Why don't you go for something specific, achievable? You know, I'm all for sex education and same-sex education and extending all of that. But I think there are campaigns out there who are doing that work, and if we can amplify their voice, that's great. The strength of the Freedom 2 campaign was that it gave everybody in the LGBT community an opportunity to make their points, to talk about the freedom that's important to them, to talk about the freedom that they don't yet enjoy, but that they want to campaign for. And it really did, somebody was talking about our common humanity sometimes being lost in all of this. It really underlined our common humanity, not just within the LGBT plus community, but way beyond. And the advertising campaign that we were able to run on the tubes and buses, the PR campaign that we ran in the Evening Standard, enabled us to reach a much broader community than just those people who would turn up for Pride, and began to help people who perhaps hadn't thought about this in the straight community, or people who are cis, to think about what it's like to not be them, but to be one of us, and to think about the freedoms we don't enjoy that they take for granted. So it may seem banal, but I think it's very fundamental, and it does go to our common humanity, that, you know, if I'm at the bus stop with my boyfriend and he's going one way and I'm the other, I think before I kiss him goodbye. I just have a quick look around me and check that there's no aggro people about. Straight person doesn't even have to entertain that thought. It doesn't even occur to them that somebody else has to. So there's a degree of education that we're doing through the Freedom 2 campaign, which, as I say, we'll repeat again this year. And we had a little event on Valentine's Day, the Freedom 2 Kiss In, which didn't go across in the straight media, the mainstream media, quite as well as we'd hoped. We got a bit of coverage in the Independent Online, but it did well in the LGBT plus press, and did the job of talking about some of our plans for this year as well, and continued that Freedom 2 theme. And I want to talk about commerciality, because I think that's a good sort of segue, because we were able to run that Freedom 2 campaign because of partnerships we'd built with commercial organisations, a large provider of outdoor advertising space, and our sponsors who paid for some of the production of that advertising and some of its placing, sometimes featuring people from their employee network groups, sometimes just helping us to meet the cost of running the campaign. And there's a concern, as ever, that Pride becomes too commercial, that we move too far away from our community roots. And I've told you already about our commitment to community. But it's a balancing act, and it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one, but it is a balancing act. We can't run Pride without about £700,000 a year. City Hall gives us £100,000. That leaves us a shortfall of £600,000. Now, sometimes when I talk to some people who work in the shiny tower blocks of Canary Wharf, they say, well, that's not very much. Okay, give it to me then. we could not fund that from the community. We tried a little bit of crowdfunding last year. The response to that was frankly disappointing. That may have been more a reflection in the degree of trust people have in us as a young organisation and the need to continue building that. Or it could be that people are used to Pride in London being free and want to retain that free access, which is quite right. So we have to build those relationships with big organisations who've got deep pockets and who want to demonstrate to their employee network groups that they're good employers, who want to look after and nurture talent in their LGBT+ community, who do want to reach out to the pink pound perhaps, want to persuade them that they're a good and trustworthy brand. We work carefully with them though to make sure that they get presence and they're able to talk about the issues that matter to them as an organisation, or that of their employees, as LGBT+ employees, but do not get in the way of the main purpose of Pride, which is giving visibility and a voice to the LGBT+ community. And that's very, very important, because if somebody can find some other way, we can get £600,000, I am all ears, and so is our finance director. So that's very important, and our pledge is that we will always work really hard to make sure that the balance is in favour of the community, giving the community a voice, giving us all visibility, so that when that young man, woman comes up from the countryside, what they don't see is a festival of brands promoting their products. And I know some people have talked about other prides around the world, and perhaps in America where that might be the case, but just people like them who can help them on their journey and give them strength to be themselves. Just one more point. I think, because I'll keep it brief, I'm standing between you and the food and drink provided by, very generously by Tesco's. Heroes. We have taken heroes as the parade theme this year. And that was a very conscious choice for a number of reasons. We're keeping Freedom to as our sort of campaigning headline, strapline if you like, but we've taken heroes as the theme for the parade for a number of reasons. One, because Freedom 2 doesn't really work as a parade theme. How do you dress up as freedom? Statue of Liberty, perhaps, I don't know. Whereas heroes are tangible, they're people. Now, I'm sure we'll get lots of Wonder Women, and I'm sure there'll be lots of Spider-Men as well, and that's great. But the heroes we really want to celebrate are like some of the people who are on this panel. Real heroes of the movement, who've blazed a trail for us all, who've taken, who had that strength and that courage in the 60s and 70s to stand up and say, this is who I am, I've had enough of not being treated like everybody else, get used to me being here. And as somebody who would never have had that courage in that hostile climate to do that, I'm immensely grateful and immensely proud of those people who've done all that work for us. So what we really want to see is that celebration of heroes from the past, and Alan Turing is a very topical one at the moment, whether it's him, whether it's Oscar Wilde, whether it's April Ashley, whoever your hero might be in the past, we want to celebrate them because we have to remember our past, we have to celebrate our past. We have to remember how hard won our freedoms are, because as Peter says, we feel very relaxed and we're very privileged now, but there is no guarantee that we will continue to enjoy these freedoms in the future. We have to fight every year to maintain and extend those freedoms. So as well as celebrating the heroes in the past, I'm very, very keen that we celebrate the heroes of the present. So whether it's somebody in your football club, whether it's somebody, I always give this mention, the South London Gay Mums, if it's one of those, if it's the person who keeps that group together, if it's somebody who volunteered tirelessly for the food chain for the past 20 years, whoever it is who's really knitting this community together again, extending our freedoms and fighting for the LGBT+ community, we want to hear about them. That's all I'm going to say. I want to thank you all again. And say the message that I take from tonight is that we need much more pride. So events like this, outside of full Pride season, if you like, we'd like to see more of. If your community group or organisation wants to run an event during our Pride Festival, that might be a football match, it might be tryouts, it might be an art exhibition, it might be a piece of theatre, it might be a debate, whatever it is, it might be a walk like outdoor lads. It could be anything. Make it part of Pride season, because London is a fabulous place and there's loads going on all the time. So to make an impact here, you've got to make a really big impact. You've got to do lots. So we, as a community, working together, can give Pride, give London the pride it deserves. So thank you all for coming tonight. You are part of the Pride family. Think about becoming more of a member of that family by volunteering or getting involved in some other way, and by nominating your Pride hero. Thank you all very much, and thanks again to our panelists.